Hello, thank you all so much for coming. It's such a treat to see a wonderful crowd out to hear the very first Visiting Writers Series event of the semester. Thank you all for coming. I'm Dan Rosenberg, and this semester marks the beginning of my co-directing this series with Becca Myers. And so I'm going to start out our intro, and then Becca is going to come in and take us into the main event, which is Kimiko Hahn's reading. My intro begins, as it always does, with thanking NYSCA, the New York State Council on the Arts, whose support allows us to bring incredible writers like Kimiko to campus. I also want to thank Richard Kegler in particular. He's the director of Wells College Press. He designed the beautiful chapbook by Kimiko Hahn that we're so excited to be officially launching tonight. Rich has been my partner in many of the projects here at Wells that I've been most proud of and most excited about, and this book certainly ranks among them. So thanks, Rich. So let me get to introducing Kimiko. She is the author of 9 books of poems, and her inspirations range from modern science to paintings to film to classical Japanese literature. We're reading her book, The Narrow Road to the Interior, in my American poetry course right now, and it takes its title from the great 19th century poet Basho, and its structure from Sei Shonagon's The Pillow Book, written in 1002. Kimiko's honors are too numerous to list, but they include a Guggenheim Fellowship, fellowships from the NEA, and the Shelley Memorial Award. She's a distinguished professor in the MFA program in creative writing and translation at Queens College in CUNY, and she's the president of the board at the Poetry Society of America. She lives in New York with her husband, the true crime writer Harold Schechter, who is here as well, and who also co-edited these incredible poetry anthologies that I am very excited to be reading. An anthology of poems about movies, and another one of poems of murder and mayhem. Fun times. Talking about Kimiko's work always seems to lead people to list a pile of contradictory adjectives. She's meditative and gritty. She's raw and rigorous. She's angry and vulnerable. Her passion is always visible on the page, and it's gloriously messy. It's liberated and promiscuous in all the best ways. She revels in breaking down boundaries, in writing poems that include emails, that include diary entries, that worry over obsessions again and again and rethink themselves as they progress. And I think it's because the speakers in her poems are always human. They're always complicatedly, honestly human. And after our son was born, Becca and I brought him to the annual Writers' Conference at AWP, and there we learned a great truth. Wonderful writers can be divided into 2 camps. The first group wears their greatness like barbed wire, and they seem annoyed when a tiny human being is drooling on their roller bags. The second group wants to pick him up and hold him and share a moment of joy about being alive with a small person to whom it's so new. Kimiko, we have pictures of this. Kimiko is the queen of the latter group, and that shared emotion, that intimacy, is what makes what her poems feel like to me too. I'm very excited to hear them, and my co-host is going to come up and give us a tiny bit of framing, and then we're going to get on to Kimiko Hahn. I should also mention there will be time for a Q&A at the end, so if you have a question or a thought, hold on to it, and we will have a chance to chat at the very end. But why don't you come on up, Becca Myers.
I want to add for the Q&A that we are using Miles's karaoke microphone. That does light up and have an echo effect, so we'll be passing that around. Okay. So I wanted to just say a few words about language and mentorship. Yesterday I sat down with Kimiko's chapbook, and I was moved by the lyric beauty of her odes. I was struck by how the language of the poets that she references in her poems have shaped her relationship to language, and how, in turn, Kimiko has shaped mine. In my American Lit survey class, we just finished reading Anne Bradstreet. Bradstreet was the first published female American poet and Puritan. She has one poem addressed to her husband Simon, in which she works through some very deep metaphysical and bodily anxieties right before the birth of one of her 8 children. Birthing children in the mid-17th century was a fraught and frequent business. Bradstreet is worried she might die, but rather than ask her husband to look for her in the afterlife, instead, she tells him to look for her on the page. And kiss this paper for thy love's dear sake, she writes. Poets never really leave us. I'm thinking of Whitman now, who 2 centuries later wrote, "If you want me again, look for me under your boot soles." Like Kimiko, I've been mentored by Whitman and Dickinson, Bishop and Bradstreet, but I've also been mentored by Kimiko. Sometimes, if we're really lucky in this life, we get to experience the page and the person. We get to benefit from their eyes on our work. Kimiko was my thesis advisor and workshop teacher in grad school at NYU, and what I've learned from her, I continually try to put into words. I only hope I can offer the same kind of creative mentorship to our students at Wells. Thank you all for coming tonight, and Kimiko, thank you for sharing your poems with us. Welcome to the stage.
Yes, I'm even more petite. Thank you. Well, thank you, Dan Rosenberg. Thank you, Becca Myers, and also Richard Kegler. What a incredible treat. I know that when I was invited to come by Becca, originally, she said that part of the deal is that I get this beautiful broadside, and I am not the kind of person who doesn't mind hearing a no. So I said, "Oh, well, I see that you have printed in your gorgeous, amazing Book Arts Center chapbooks. So would you consider doing that?" And Dan was like, well, what are we talking about here?" So I actually sent several sequences, and he chose this one, and I'm so grateful. I'm so grateful. I just saw it like an hour ago, and so Rich, thank you, Dan, Becca, thank you. I couldn't be happier. In fact, I'm not letting them send it through the mail. My husband has to carry it around all night until we get to the car. Not letting it out of my sight. It is so beautiful. Okay, so thank you all for coming. I have been I've been called a bit of a magpie when it comes to writing prompts or my subject matter. So I take material, whatever's in front of me, whether it's Walt Whitman poem, right, or whether it's I worked on a documentary film on black lung disease, so I've written about black lung. And for my last 2 books were prompted by the New York Times science section, which comes out every Tuesday. So every Tuesday I would have new writing prompts, which is very convenient. So I'm going to start reading some poems from Toxic Flora, and then a few also from Brain Fever. The Search for Names. The right to name Planet X belonged to the Lowell Observatory, where the Kansas farm boy engaged to photograph night heavens using a blink comparator quickly suggested Slipher after his superior. The widow, Constance Lowell, suggested Zeus, Lowell, and Constance. Then 11-year-old English girl Venetia Burney put forward Pluto, ruler of the underworld, also a dark and cold terrain, and a god who could turn invisible. She was eating breakfast with her grandfather, Falconer Madden, when he read about the search in the dailies. Lucky girl, fortunate planet, exultant netherworld. A bowl of spaghetti. I have a lot of quotes from science. Also, I'm going to talk a little bit now and again on writing, because I know some of you are in writing classes, and I'm hoping that's cool. If you're not, the reason why I am so captivated by science has something to do with the science itself, or whatever I'm reading, but has even more to do with the language of science, which for me is exotic. I didn't grow up reading a lot of science. I was a hippie, didn't pay attention to science and math. So coming back to it in the Science Times is an incredible treat. And the words act as a kind of portal for me to walk through. So I have a lot of scientific language and even quotes. So this begins with a quote. A bowl of spaghetti. To find a connectome, or the mental makeup of a person, researchers experimented with the neurons of a worm, then upgraded to mouse, hoping to unravel the millions of miles of wires in the human brain that they likened to untangling a bowl of spaghetti, of which I have an old photo. Ray in her high chair intently picking out each strand to mash in her mouth. Was she too? Was that sailor dress from Mother? Did I cook that sauce from scratch? If so, there was a carrot in the pot, as Mother instructed, and I'll never forget, no matter which strand, determines ardor as a daughter's verdict. Giraffes. After skimming the Sunday Times, Dad turned to the back of the magazine and tore out the crossword puzzle for his mother in Wisconsin. As routine as my calligraphy class on Saturdays, flute practice exactly 20 minutes on school nights, and astringent twice daily. I loved the idea of puzzles, but never tried my hand as problem solving rubbed up against rivalry. Red velvet cake, red velvet dress, trilling. Because nothing was never enough, and yet more than a small rectangular lawn and the pulsing marsh beyond. A puzzle might have been escape enough. A maze instead of crossword? No, crosswords were our puzzles, after all. Although my sister and I adored jigsaw pieces, 500, a zoo, I think, giraffes, absolutely. So Toxic Flora is kind of a mix of poems that have to do with insects, birds, especially birds that eat insects, astronomy, all sorts of stuff. It's just whatever sort of captivated me at the time. For Brain Fever, I thought I was finished with science, but I like to say that science was not finished with me. So I already thought I had other things to write and do, but I got stalled a little bit. So I decided to go back to the Science Times, back to science, and instead of taking one article and then writing a poem, I decided to take one article and just write a bunch of poems. I ended up mostly writing on the brain and cognitive science, which I knew nothing about then and still know nothing about. So I'm going to read a little bit from my sequence on dreams. So triggered by dream theory. And this has very much to do with associative work. So you think of, which is what I think dreams do, right? You hear a word, or a word catches in your brain, and then where does that word lead you? Like the word parsnips. The dream of parsnips. Do I wish for a box of cigars or dynamite? Do I wish for a sudden squirming of earthworms? Do I wish for the dense smell in Grandma Ida's dining room or some prefix? Do I wish for the standing outside his lit office at 2 a.m, as only a sophomore can stand, or for the husband to scrap the skank? Or perhaps for the researcher herself who believes that dreaming is not a parallel state, but consciousness itself, in the absence of the senses input. Considering various explanatory projects, I do wish that wishing would process whatever calls up an object so white and duplicitous. The dream of a pillow. Zealous mother or breast? Zealous marshmallow, zealous feathers. Although the neuroscientist does not declare, so what? She does believe the brain observes props and scene in a lucid watchfulness, which may utterly play out in proverb or verse, or be utterly meaningless. Zealous codeine, zealous noose. The dream of knife, fork, and spoon. I can't recall where to set the knife and spoon. I can't recall which side to place the napkin, or which bread plate belongs to me, or how to engage in benign chatter. I can't recall when more than one fork, which to use first, or what to make of a bowl of water. I can't see the place cards or recall any names in this dream. The humiliation is impressive, the scorn. No matter how much my brain revises the dinner to see if the host was a family member, I can't recall which dish ran away with which spoon. The dream of a lacquer box. I wish I knew the contents, and I wish the contents Japanese, like hairpins made of tortoise shell or bone, though my hair was lopped off, though my braid was lopped off long ago, like overpowering pine incense, or a talisman from a Kyoto shrine, like a Hello Kitty diary lock and key, Hello Kitty stickers or candies, a netsuke in the shape of a squid, ticket stubs from a double suicide. Or am I wishing for mother, searching for sister, just hoping to give something Japanese to my daughters? Then again, people can read anything into dreams, and I do as well. I wish I possessed my mother's black lacquer box, though in my dream it was red, though I wish my heart were content. I don't know what came over me when I wrote this, but anyway. Well, actually, I can. I was reading about how in the Middle Ages, it was kind of biological warfare. people would take corpses that were dead from the bubonic plague and they'd catapult them. Sorry, that's not really funny. But they'd catapult them over the wall. So things like that just, what? So this poem is called Frank. In the Middle Ages, Dr. Roy Gulick said, corpses of people who died of plague were used as biological weapons by catapulting them into walled cities. This infected townspeople and catapulters alike, though it's unclear whether the disease spread by bodily secretions or fleas. Why Frank from Valhalla, New York, would ask a news blogger if one could contract plague from a corpse, I can only imagine. Welcome to my world. I guess that's welcome to my brain. Okay. Cherry stems. I'm not too happy that fruit flies have brains, since I swat them whenever I see them or think I see them. I know about their brains because I met a scientist who tinkers with their learning circuitry, the actual mechanics of how a memory trace is laid down in a nerve cell or neuron. All this proxy, dissecting the behavior of an insect to figure out how the brain works for something like typing, at which my mother was a pro, and me fairly miserable because of some disorder, which it seems my daughter has inherited since she also exhibits left-right confusion. However, she can twist a cherry stem into a bow with her tongue, an ability no doubt from an ancestral brain, but which also reveals something about a summer in Florence. In other words, too much information regarding memory trace. I'm going to read from this brand new chapbook, hot off the press. And it's entitled Write It, which is in quotes, and the write is italicized, and there's an exclamation, a lot going on in that title. And that is taken from a Elizabeth Bishop poem, famous Villanelle. I had, whenever I have to go away, especially on business, I like to try and carve out a little time for myself and do some writing. So I was at actually another AWP conference last year, I think, and I love giving myself assignments, so writing prompts. So I thought, oh, I've been assigning odes. I should write an ode. An ode to what? What do I love? I love other poems that people have written. So I figured out I'd write odes to lines of poetry. So I'm going to actually start out with a poem I'm pretty sure you're not familiar with. A friend of mine wrote this poem. Her name is Mina Alexander. She was originally from India, and the line is, ashwagandha, miracle herb, will it cure us? And this is a poem, her poem was written about trying to seek alternative treatment to cancer, so she could do both the heavy-duty treatment and also alternative ones. So this is Ode to Ashwagandha, Miracle Herb, Will It Cure Us? When I read you aloud, I read with a lilt, a lift, hers, a bright melancholy, more musing than question, more prayer or plain calling out than a plea to the winter cherry. And months later, the reply arrives as an abduction from all miracles. So I'm going to read an ode to a line from Walt Whitman. What I want to do is actually read the bit of the Walt Whitman from which this line arrives. So this is from this is a section from Song of Myself, Walt Whitman. 28 young men bathe by the shore. 28 young men and all so friendly. 28 years of womanly life and all so lonesome. I'm gonna start this again. So one reason I love this section is because Walt Whitman is writing from the point of view of a woman inside a home, looking out her window, parlor window, and seeing these naked men swimming nearby. And of course, we know that's Walt Whitman, right? Thinking about looking out the window, seeing these handsome young men. So, 28 young men bathe by the shore. 28 young men and all so friendly. 28 years of womanly life and all so lonesome. She owns the fine house by the rise of the bank. She hides, handsome and richly dressed, aft the blinds of the window. Which of the young men does she like the best? Ah, the homeliest of them is beautiful to her. Where are you off to, lady? For I see you. You splash in the water there, yet stay stock still in your room. Dancing and laughing along the beach came the 29th bather. The rest did not see her, but she saw them and loved them. The beards of the young men glistened with wet. It ran from their long hair. Little streams passed over their bodies. An unseen hand also passed over their bodies. It descended trembling from their temples and ribs. The young men float on their backs. Their white bellies bulge to the sun. They do not ask who seizes fast to them. They do not know who puffs and declines with pendant and bending arch. They do not think whom they souse with spray. Ode to They Do Not Think Whom They Souse with Spray. When the Iowa River overcame its banks, souse did not occur to me. When I knew souse, the naked dive and hoisting onto shore, the dripping from hair on body and beard. Spring lawns had debuted coarse and brown. By the time I called out for souse, he'd packed his thermos and marked up leaves of grass, walked under the trestle, then home to his spouse. He didn't realize me in that threshold, but I knew that you tendered souse, so please remind me, as a sounding does. This is Ode to Someone Had Blundered, and it's from a poem I read probably in grade school, The Charge of the Light Brigade. And in it, there's massive death because one of the generals, I guess it would be, had blundered about the warfare. Ode to Someone Had Blundered. Not blinded, you. Not bonded or banned, you. More, you're a spelunker showing up others' hackneyed rope, twisted and frayed. Me, I try not to be afraid, so help me, poetry, I beg of you. I want to read one of my most favorite poems by Elizabeth Bishop. if I don't start weeping. It's called First Death in Nova Scotia. And it's from the point of view of a child. First Death in Nova Scotia. In the cold, cold parlor, my mother laid out Arthur beneath the chromographs. Edward, Prince of Wales, with Princess Alexandra, and King George with Queen Mary. Below them on the table stood a stuffed loon, shot and stuffed by Uncle Arthur, Arthur's father. Since Uncle Arthur fired a bullet into him, he hadn't said a word. He kept his own counsel on his white frozen lake, the marble-top table. His breast was deep and white, cold and caressable. His eyes were red glass, much to be desired. "Come," said my mother, "come and say good-bye to your little cousin Arthur." I was lifted up and given one lily of the valley to put in Arthur's hand. Arthur's coffin was a little frosted cake, and the red-eyed loon eyed it from his white frozen lake. Arthur was very small. He was all white like a doll that hadn't been painted yet. Jack Frost had started to paint him the way he always painted the maple leaf forever. He had just begun on his hair a few red strokes, and then Jack Frost had dropped the brush and left him white forever. The gracious royal couples were warm and red and ermine. Their feet were well wrapped up in the ladies' ermine trains. They invited Arthur to be the smallest page at court. But how could Arthur go, clutching his tiny lily, with his eyes shut up so tight, and the roads deep in snow? Ode to But How Could Arthur Go, Clutching His Tiny Lily. Like a train lowing through the still dark, you express the try to guess, the wish to maybe, the inkling from adult gesture lifted up, so that one day Elizabeth's query will be met with not the road deep in snow, but a vehicle for the wonder that belies where Arthur goes. This is a line from a Wilfred Owen poem. He was a soldier in the First World War and actually died right, I think, like a week before the end of the war. And this poem, the title of the poem is Dulce et decorum est. It is sweet and right to die for one's country. Ode to Till on the haunting flares we turned our backs. Honestly, you're one of many gray, rank lines that yank me from milquetoast trauma to the world that supported the old lie in 1918. Still, we also knew lies in 1968 and on, like 2019, since every year there's a war, including the shots that flare inside one's own precinct. You know, not necessarily armed combat. So this line is Do I Dare Disturb the Universe? From a very long poem that I'd love to read, but it's way too long. It's T.S. Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, where a rather timid man is wondering if he can sort of get over himself, ask this woman to see him. And that's just really symbolic of all the things he wishes he could push himself to do. Ode to Do I Dare Disturb the Universe? Yes, though rarely this universe these days, unlike those where I'd stand at a payphone, dialing him who I could not call from home, unlike younger years in socialist cells, arguing how to seize state power. Disturbance then, as natural as avalanche. Now I bite my tongue when I detrain to visit an adult child. Disturb? What do you now mean? My once lifeline, my directive, erstwhile. I'm so amazed and glad that the word socialist isn't a bad word anymore. My goodness, never was in my book. I'm gonna after toxic Flora and brain fever, I thought, oh, as opposed to brain fever, well, I've written about science enough already. I thought, oh, well, now I could have a trilogy. I should just crank out another book with science in it. Well, so I tried doing that, and at a certain point, I just realized these are really bad poems. So 10 years later, I now have a new collection coming out next year, 2020, called Foreign Bodies. And I've kept a few of those poems, actually. I saved a few that actually were not too bad, were pretty good. Well, poems that were good. I'm not going to put a poem that's not too bad in my book. Foreign bodies, the term comes from a doctor who invented an endoscopy to take things out of child's esophagus and bodies. And then I began to think about, well, also foreign body, the immigrant body as well. So that book is really taken off to be about different kinds of foreign bodies and also objects. My father was a hoarder, and so when he died, my sister and I had a lot of objects. So there's a lot about that as well. So it's a more personal collection. However, this is another one of the poems that I've saved and rigorously revised. This is a longish one, so sit back, much longer than the little odes. And it's on the life of a woman named Mary Anning, who was alive in the 19th century. And she was a poor girl, one of several children growing up in the Lyme Regis area of England, now called the Jurassic Coast of England. She and her father and brother would go, he was a carpenter, as I said, but they would go to the coastline after or during storms, and they'd pull out these enormous and sometimes very small fossils. So she became, in effect, one of the first and really important fossil hunters, but she was uneducated at the time. She was not well educated, so she educated herself amazingly and was not given credit very much during her life. So I was captivated by this, and so here's a poem. Oh, and the tongue twister, this poem is titled, it's difficult to say, She Sells Seashells. So you know that tongue twister, that's her. That's Mary Anning. She Sells Seashells, or Considering the Life of Mary Anning. When a high tide withdraws, a shell burrows down with its foot, and should that muck harden, the razor, say, may petrify, over millennia. Such demise may be a little girl's good fortune, especially in 1811. If only I believed in talismans, especially in regard to my dragonfly, possessed by stone for eons. To make ends meet, Mary climbed a local cliff with tools to pry out spirals, snake stones she'd sell to neighbors convinced of their charming powers. Mary was named after her departed sister, who tossed sawdust on the kitchen hearth, inspiring flames to her bib and burning her to bits. Me, I was instructed to so fear a match. When the lesson came to strike one, I twisted, shrieked, and wept, but the penniless Annings scraped by against the raw ocean air. The vertebrates, sea lilies, scuttle, and thunderstones had lodged in strata for millennia above the English Channel and below the Annings' dark, dank cottage. By the Sawmill River, my own parents stratified seeds in their garden, though weeds disallowed them to seek the light of day ever. Miss, she sells seashells on the seashore, after a furious storm, found a flying dragon in the Lyme Regis sediment. Often gone all day long, all day alone, turbulence was her best companion, revealing where to look for bones. I found an egg dyed yellow and green. I found my mother when she'd died. I mean, when she'd hide. I did not find an almond's horn. I did find a piece of matzah beneath a tablecloth, and I found my mother dead, to which a cousin asked, "What does that mean, to find someone dead? Lackluster? Uncaring? Without a mirror for her little girl?" Bleeding tooth and pelican foot, Venus co-murex, keyhole limpet, a hobby for some. For the Annings bought bread, maybe mutton, maybe the Dissenter's theological magazine. Still, I wish I could have chiseled out a plesiosaurus, especially to query Genesis, to discover something as stupendous as extinction. After a common storm, Mr. Anning fell from a ledge, suffering till he died. Mary's dog similarly perished just feet from where she stood. I wouldn't want to pry over the swirling coast that cost so much. Mary didn't possess any such choice and faced rude currents to stay afloat. Quote, "They say Miss Anning attends Colonel Birch. These men of learning have sucked her brains." Richard Dinosaur Owen rarely stooped to dirty his hands in the field. Coprolite, fossilized feces, finely illustrated. Mary untangled seaweed from the dead woman's hair. To Darwin's professor, she wrote, "The find looks like a skeleton with a head like a pair of scissors, analogous to nothing." Even so, the geologist paid no attention to her transitional creature. "Mary's a very clever, funny creature," said Dr. Featherstone Ha as he purchased the spine of a sea beast she'd found. "My aunt said that shells can be alive. Some are left-handed, some right. Most have a door and a foot. Very funny," I thought, determined next holiday to search high and low. King Frederick visited the Annings Fossil Depot to purchase an ichthyosaur, the crocodile with flippers, the undulating fish lizard? Was it Mary's torso? Brother Joseph's skull? Or was the skeleton complete? Strange how the body is so undependable, except at the last moment. Some baby shells swim about. Others dig into mudflats or latch onto random stone and stem. When my own babies settled into silt, I had to rake them out, just as my mother coaxed with indulgences. Mary's mother at first forbade her to clamber up those cliffs, scolded by tide and sea mist, but in the end feared more the ubiquitous poorhouse. Some shells have eyes. All have mouth and anus, employed to move along. I've watched a sand dollar drag its pattern in the silt, a beautiful primal moment. In Mary's time, marked by the reign of a queen, even a 20-foot fossil gave a woman no purchase. Some shells leap out of water. Some leap off a boat's deck back into a more kindred habitat. Mary bought her own house so she could properly dust and polish the so-called curiosities that evolved into patriarchal, paleontological import. Not so odd that a soft, fleshy creature builds a stony home, smooth, ribbed, warty, or spiny. From a fold excreting particles of lime, more strange is a creature of flesh who can't protect herself thus, regardless of cranium or cul-de-sac residence. Although the warty professors visited her seaside home, bartered then took credit for her finds, when all was done and said again, she who sold seashells found fossils more stellar than a tongue twister, having had the black ven Dover Cliff as taskmistress. Envoy. She sells seashells on the seashore, sold the so-called curios. Some have eyes, some coprolite, most have a door and a foot. Some shells swim about, below the coastal cliff, near her home, near Bleeding Tooth and Pelican Foot, and their healing powers, but no one wants to puzzle over an overhanging house or stony abode or a funny tongue twister, but with or without a charm, a girl can fashion a mirror of her own. Thank you. Woo!
Are we really doing this?
Sure.
Yeah, if you're feeling particularly shy, we have the karaoke mic. But,
Yes, you can also shout out. If you don't ask me questions, I'll ask you all questions. So. As my next writing prompts.
So first of all, the image of the millions of miles of wires inside your brain. It's incredible.
Oh, good.
That's just incredible.
Oh, good. Thank you. I can't take credit for that, although I guess I do have my own millions of miles.
Well, just the way it was in that poem right there was very beautiful.
Thank you.
The Mina, the poem you had about Mina Alexander.
Yes.
And so and I couldn't quite catch everything.
Sure.
The last couple of lines, but it was abduct all the miracles or something. Would you be willing to just maybe say that again? It was just
Sure.
beautiful.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, thank you for asking me. And months later, the reply to the question, will it cure us? The reply arrives as an abduction from all miracles. Yeah. Yeah. Mina Alexander, has, I don't know, over a dozen, maybe 2 dozen books. I don't know. She just died last November, and this chapbook is dedicated to her. Yeah, thank you.
I have a
Yes.
question actually about your revision process.
Mhm.
We're reading in the narrow road to the interior
Oh.
a book that is full of things that look. Um, Actually, we're having debates in class about the organization of it because you have a series of tanka that are numbered, but the numbers are not in order and they're not complete. And we're talking about, is this the numbered order of composition that you've then rearranged but kept like how?
Yes.
What's the that's what it is. But like, what is the process? Like, what is the how do you approach revision? Maybe is the larger question.
So that feels like 2 questions. One about revising poems, and the other about ordering how to arrange a book. For these, for the longer pieces that are hybrid, prose and poetry pieces, I find motifs and themes and I highlight them, literally highlight them, and then I spread it out on the floor and I see where things are and where more needs to happen here, less there, and then where I want to end. I kind of do that with poems as well, but with really long pieces, I'll just spread it out on the floor, which actually is what I like to do with books as well. With not with Narrow Road. I'm forgetting which book, but my editor. Oh, with the first book I did with my editor at Norton, her name is Jill Bielowski. She's a genius when it comes. She's a shamaness when it comes to being an editor, also a poet and prose writer. I had given her this book, Mosquito and Ant, which has a lot of poems that sound like, that have the tone and point of view of letters, epistolary poems. So I had them in a very neat section with other poems in other very neat sections. And she took it and just flipped them all together to create one long poem in effect. And I learned so much about how to rearrange books, rearrange poems in a collection. She's done that with my other books, not every single one, but with other books as well. With Toxic Flora, I had 3 very long prose hybrid pieces, and she said, those feel like they weight down the more lyric, shorter pieces. Why don't you take those 3 long pieces out? I was crushed. But she said, take one of those long pieces and just take a few paragraphs and flip it through to give a kind of through line. So in case you're interested in the book, I took a piece, a long piece on sexual cannibalism. Why not? So that's the one. Those are the paragraphs that are dealt through Toxic Flora. I told you I write about everything, anything. Yes. Land on those particular lines for the odes. A number of them are from poems I that made an impression on me as a child or as a young person. Someone had blundered. I mean, that's what a crazy line, right? And then, yeah, right. Oops. Forward the Light Brigade. Was there a man dismayed? Someone had blundered. Anyway, so some were just always in my head. I'm very bad at memorizing poems, but certain lines stay with me, and they become, in effect, a part of my body. They become so important. So that's how I chose those lines. So I didn't look for them. I just wrote down lines that were important to me, and then I responded. So, ode to someone had blundered, it's you. I'm speaking to the line. This is what you do for me. I have a relationship with the line, right, as an ode. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. You know, I'm a really very bad, very poor, very weak reader. So I didn't read a lot of novels. I read more poetry. I guess the answer is yes, more than most. Yes, the answer is yes. Not as much as I should have, perhaps, but more than most. Yeah. Yes.
You said that when you are reading different science articles or pieces as a part of your research practice, you like have called yourself a magpie of that subject matter. But do you feel like because you don't have that grounding in the science in that way, that are you anxious about writing about that, or do you feel beholden to the truth in some way, or is there like a
Yeah.
truth there?
Yeah. Yes, there is a truth there because I'm not really writing about science. I'm writing about myself. So a little anecdote. When I was putting together the Toxic Flora manuscript, I was reading some of the poems at a reading such as this, and I mentioned where the writing prompts came from, the Science Times, and a young man came up and said, "I'm an editor at the Science Times." Like, oh my God. And he said, "When the book comes out, let me know. Here's my email, and I'll invite you to a staff meeting." I was like, oh my God, what amazing. So book came out, contacted him. I went to one of the Tuesday staff meetings there. As I'm emerging from the subway into the Times Square area with my book, I literally broke out into a cold sweat, and I thought, what is wrong with you? You just stole from all these world-class journalists, your, gods and goddesses of science writing, but I'm shameless. So that's the other part of your answer, of your question. I'm totally shameless because I'm not writing about science. I don't pretend to write about science or really understand it. I hope that in the context of my poems, that the scientific information is not false. So I went to the science staff meeting, and I read a few poems, and then I sent the book around. I noted that all the writers and all the articles that I quote from are in the back of the book. So I was very amused when I sent the book around. They were all looking to see if I had included any of their work. So I felt that made me feel better. But it was, it was so thrilling to meet them. There is a poem I have on an insect that is incorrect, but that's because I was using an entomology textbook. Entomology is study of bugs from like 1918 or early 1900s, and they had gotten something wrong about the cicada. So, oops. Not my fault. Yeah. Did that answer your question? Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. to take a look at that. That was many books ago. I was reading a book actually on the scientist who invented the endoscopy, and okay, excellent. I came across the phrase identity theme. And this is a phrase I'd been looking for years, because I believe that we have identity themes from a very early age, and they follow us, they live with us. So I pretty much all my work is about jealousy, envy, and betrayal. So am I ever going to write about something else? Probably not. Maybe foreign bodies is something else. I'm looking for that poem. Pardon me? Okay. Did I answer your question? Because I can't find the poem. Okay, good. I saw another hand. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, with the sequences in brain fever that have to do with different articles on the brain, dream theory, the unconscious, and so forth, time and the brain. I just wrote a lot. I didn't think for each sequence. I just wrote a lot. I didn't set out to write a sequence necessarily. I wrote a lot, and I thought, well, maybe one poem will come out of it. But in fact, I was able to come up with little sequences, and then I have scattered through that individual poems. I think at a certain point, I started moving into writing about other stuff, and that's kind of a signal for me that I was finished with the collection, which is originally called The Clipping Morgue, which is a title I love, but no one else liked it. So then I wrote a poem to go with that title. But so it became Brain Fever. Yeah, when I start moving into other areas, like, okay, done with the brain. I'm starting to write poems about Mary Anning, say, something else. Oh, yeah. That part of me? Mm-hmm. The question is, in terms of my interest in cognitive science, or what? What gives us a drive to create poetry? Well, my research is mostly looking for material to write about, so I don't actually do that kind of research at all. I don't have the skills to do that. My theory about life, though, my theory about life, and it is scientific, is that everything is about stimulation, whether it's photosynthesis or bread or poetry, different kinds of stimulation. So that's your answer. You're welcome. I think I saw one more hand. Yeah. Oh, good, good. Well, one reason I enjoyed writing that, thank you for spotting that. I literally can stand in shallow water. My husband will attest to that, and watch little hermit crabs fighting each other, ganging up on each other sometimes. But one of the real pleasures you could probably tell in writing the Mary Anning poem was, I kept going back to my own experiences, just digging around and wading around in water. I just love that. So I'm an amateur naturalist. I just love, I don't really want to touch insects, but I like to watch them and I like to read about them. I don't really necessarily want to hold them, although I have held some. But yeah, but I love to observe that. I think it's important. Yeah. Well, thank you very much. And I'm signing. Up, so.
I'm going to bring this up for one last second. So, as we discussed, this is the official publication of the chapbook. They are for sale for $10, and for those of you who are here at the launch, I'm looking at Rich for confirmation. Yes. If you buy Kimiko Hahn's Write It, you will also get a copy of Annie Lightheart's Lantern. Annie Lightheart won our chapbook contest 2 years ago, and that first edition was sold out. That first printing sold out. So the new printing of Lantern and Write It are the two first books in our new chapbook series. And so buy one, get the other. Of course, Kimiko would be happy to sign your copy of Write It and maybe your copy of Annie's book if you want her to. It's fine. If you have PayPal or Venmo or a card, we can make any of those work. Just come up and talk to me. Our next events are on February 26th. That's when fiction writer and poet David Lloyd is coming to Wells. 5:30 right here, he's doing a master class called On Sestinas and Stories, Writing Across Genres. And then at 7:30, he'll be reading from his new collection of short stories, The Moving of the Water, over in the AER in Macmillan Hall. We'll be announcing this. However you heard about this, you will hear about that as well in the same way. And I hope to see you there. Thank you so much for coming. Tomorrow at 12:30, right here, this room will be magically transformed back into a lounge, and Kimiko will be hosting a master class on the Sensationally Short Poem. So if you're available tomorrow at 12:30, please come back right here. We'll be doing that. That'll be fun and exciting. And that is the end. Thank you so much all for coming, and can we give one more round of applause to Kimiko Hahn?